He knew before the doors closed. Not from anything. Said nothing had been said yet, but from the way the air shifted as King Charles's private secretary asked for a word before the banquet. From the way his father's eyes slid off his, caverned by illness and polite evasion. From the way Camilla's smile had been too polished in the receiving corridor, like lacquer over a crack. Something was wrong in the bone and marrow sense, and William felt it as surely as he felt the starched collar against his throat. That morning had begun with safety. Toast popping, kettles humming, butter softening in its dish, the warm small rhythms that make families feel immortal. The briefing folder lay open on the table, guest lists, seating charts, notes on trade and culture. Yet he read and understood none of it. Kate set tea down beside him, steam coiling between them like a thin private fog. She didn't look up when she said, "You're reading without seeing." He nearly told the polite lie that would spare them both. Instead, he told the truth. "Something's off with Pa. He's rehearsed." The word tasted wrong in his mouth. "Our last 2 meetings were cancelled. He's distant when we do speak." As if every conversation has been drafted beforehand. George barreled in wearing half a school uniform and all of childhood. Why dress up for tonight? Why miss a party? William swallowed the old guilt, the one that comes from offering duty to a child like a lesson rather than a gift. Kate saved them with the tone mothers have used for centuries, even and ordinary. "Looking after people takes different shapes," she said. "Sometimes it's birthday cake, sometimes it's silver spoons." George's family tree poster landed over the briefing folder like a curtain. The neat pencil branches climbed backward through 1,000 years, then paused beneath his son's name. Question marks. Little quiet hooks waiting for answers life hadn't given yet. William felt those blanks as a physical sensation, as heavy as the crown and as fragile as an eggshell. He was still staring at them when his phone buzzed. "His Majesty requests you arrive early. Private word, 4:30 p.m. By the time the car slid through London, photographers had already scented the shift. The swarm gathered along the mall, lenses winking like insects in the pale light. Kate's hand found his knee. "What's the worst thing you think he'll say?" she asked, and the boy in him briefly answered, "That he's dying. That he's leaving me with it all." He didn't say it aloud. The car's hush had the texture of another car on another day. Balmoral, a private word. A different catastrophe, and he forced the memory back into its cage. Buckingham Palace looked less like a home than a proscenium. Every window bright, every room a stage, every gesture rehearsed. But the study where Charles waited was not a stage. Wood-panelled, old book-scented, bright with the exact kind of English light that makes faces look honest. His father appeared smaller inside it, the way illness draws the outline of a person tighter and tighter, until there's scarcely room to breathe. Camilla stood behind him, as if she were lending her spine to his. "Not permanently," Charles said after the opening pleasantries had dissolved. A pause. A focus on recovery. William felt that peculiar relief that is half love, half fear. Not dying then, not yet. He asked what was needed, ready to be useful. "Arrangements," Charles said, and the word was a key that fit too many locks. "Preparations for eventualities," Camilla broke in too quickly. "Not now, darling," as a kind of quickness that admits what the words try to hide. When William rose to leave, he heard her voice through the thin door to the antechamber, low and urgent. "Not yet. He doesn't need to know before." He walked the corridor with a new, clean-edged fear. His mind became a ledger, and all the day's small oddities lined up like numbers that refused to stop adding. Upstairs, Kate fastened his cufflinks, the silver pair his grandmother had given him. History compressed into a gleam, and reminded him he could be both son and prince. He watched them in the mirror, 2 people who belonged to each other, and to something larger that took and gave in unequal measure. "Choose truth," she told him, the simplest and hardest instruction in the world. The state dining room glittered. It always glitters. Crystal light washed over white linen. A sea of diplomats shimmered and murmured. The tiara at Camilla's temple sent sharp little constellations across ceiling plaster. William understood every step of this choreography. Smile, greet, exchange, repeat. But his attention kept boomeranging to 3 points. His father's left hand, tremor, Camilla's phone, buzz, face-down buzz, and a man who appeared in the receiving line like a name from a childhood footnote. Sir Edmund Hartley. Retired royal advisor, silver hair, upright spine, low-voiced confidences from years ago. Camilla greeted him with a warmth that was not the warmth she offered strangers. Charles saw. His eyes tightened by a single degree. Protocol placed William near the head of the table and Kate many chairs away, a diplomatic calculus that could move nations and separate hands. Camilla landed at his left. If it was chance, the evening had developed a sense of humor. First course, scallops engineered into petals. Second course, a fish lacquered by butter and patience. Conversation rose and fell around them like a polite tide, and under it that other tide. Camilla speaking of old family friends, Sir Edmund raising a glass by a fraction, the text that blinked and died on a phone, placed where no phone should sit during a state dinner. When Charles stood to speak, the room held itself very still, the way a room does when a king gathers breath. The words came measured and proper. Then they faltered, as if the sentence had stepped off a curb it could not see. In the 2 beats of silence that followed, Camilla rose. Her smile could have lit a chapel. "Perhaps I might add a few words," she said, in a tone designed to make interruptions sound like caretaking. "Old loyalties," she said. "Survival," she said. "The vocabulary of winter." Her gaze met Sir Edmund's across the table, and his glass lifted in answer. The words landed like stones in a pond. Their ripples reached phones just as the first notifications began to buzz against linen. The leak arrived not like thunder, but like weather already in motion when you notice the trees bending. A junior aide slid to the king's private secretary. The whisper traveled. Faces changed. William's private office texted him before the articles fully published. Correspondence between the Queen Consort and Sir Edmund, months long. Financial arrangements, transitional language, when the time comes, securing continuity, positioning. All the little numbers in his ledger added at once. The sound his chair made when he rose carved a line through the room's murmuring. Cameras, there are never cameras, and yet there are always cameras, tilted toward him like flowers toward the sun. He did not plan to speak. The words found their own path out of his chest. "Family matters," Camilla said. "Too quick." The old talisman, taken out of context. "Succession schemes," he answered, and the room inhaled together. He did not raise his voice, and still it carried. "How long have you been preparing for him to fail?" The worst sentence, said in the worst place, in the worst moment, in the best armor he could find. Fury laced with care. To her credit, or to her failing, Camilla dropped the mask for a breath. "Because you're not ready," she said, and the truth in that was sharp as glass. The room didn't know where to look. At the king's hand braced on the table, at the consort's blazing eyes, at the heir's steadied stance, or at the diplomat pretending to examine a dessert he would later swear he couldn't name. Somewhere beyond all of them, the institution took notes with a pen that ran only in black ink. The evening ended, not with applause, but with extraction. Staff moved the way only staff in an ancient household can, swiftly, invisibly, precisely. Apologies were made in 4 languages. Cameras were escorted to the cold. A historic room stood briefly empty beneath its chandeliers, flickering as if asked to hold its own breath now. "Come," Kate murmured, and her hand became a corridor back to oxygen. In a small drawing room that held his mother's ghost in gilt and silk, William watched relief and reprimand fight for purchase in his wife's eyes. "What you did was a disaster," she said, and also the only honest thing in that room. Both things could be true, the ruin and the righteousness. The knock came as if it had been waiting behind his shoulder all evening. The king asked to see his son alone. The walk to the study felt like rowing upriver, each stroke necessary, each yard hard won, the current of 1,000 years tugging with its own relentless logic. Charles had shed his jacket and some of his royalness. The lamplight picked out the tremor in his hands. The desk between them was the same desk that had borne the weight of a boy's lectures and a man's briefings, and the hurt that had not been spoken yet lay on it too. "Are you embarrassed, her?" the king said first, as if duty required this order of operations. And then the sentence changed shape, softened in the middle. "You embarrassed me." William braced for the defense he had prepared in the lift, the corridor, the doorknob. It wasn't necessary. The next words were not a deflection. They were a crack in the sky. "The doctors gave me months," Charles said. No preface. No euphemism. No rehearsed evasion. Not years, months. The word was a small ship that barely contained the gravity it carried. I asked her to help, to prepare. Edmund knows the old families, the families still holding levers you can't see from the outside. There are arrangements I wanted in place, so you wouldn't have to assemble a kingdom while grieving. Something in William untensed and broke at the same time. It would be easier, so much easier, if betrayal were simple, if motives lived in one color. But love and fear travel together. Survival wears the same clothes as scheming. Protection can look like secrecy from the outside. He remembered Camilla's toast, the word she had chosen, the certainty in it. Survival. Why keep me out? He asked, the oldest question in any family. The answer was the oldest answer. Because I wanted to spare you, Charles said. And because you would have tried to spare me back. And neither of us can afford the time that kind of mercy takes. He could have shouted then. He could have spoken about childhood and Balmoral, and the shape of grief when you are 15 and every door says private word, and every corridor ends in a world without a mother. Instead, he said the quiet thing he had needed most to say. I can only carry what you let me hold. They built something in that room. Not peace, not yet, but a framework. Transparency about the illness. Inclusion in the planning. A conversation with Camilla that was not an ambush but a measured bridge. Charles did not demand a son's apology. He asked for a man's understanding. William offered both. On the way home, the car felt like a vessel moving through black water. The city outside was beautiful in that way. Cities are when you should be asleep and aren't. Windows like constellations, roads that seem to know where you're going when you don't. Months, he told Kate, and she took the word without dropping it, the way you take a sleeping child from a car seat. He confessed the shape of his fear, the error of his certainty, the relief and the shame braided through everything. She answered the only way that ever worked between them, by refusing to lie and refusing to leave. You were wrong, she said, and right. Both can be true. So what will you do next? Adelaide Cottage greeted them with small proofs that life continues. The porch light left on, the faint smell of soap, the family tree still on the table, its pencil question marks patient and accusing. William sat and held the pencil above the blank branches. He did not write names. He wrote one word in his mind and placed it on the paper as if the mark would stay even if the graphite didn't. Heir. Not the one the world cared about, his son, but the meaning of the role itself, the strange vocation of being the person who gets the future, whether he wants it or not. Tomorrow would be for consequences. For calls to private secretaries and palace lawyers, and governments who had witnessed a crack in public and would want plaster in private. For a conversation with Camilla that would need to include the words "I'm sorry" and also the words "Don't ever do that again without me." For explaining to a 10-year-old why adults sometimes wear armor and forget that voices can pierce it. But tonight, they were allowed ordinary mercy. Tea in chipped mugs, bare feet on tile, the kitchen's old clock minding the hour. He told Kate what he would try to be, not his grandmother's kind of monarch, inevitable and invulnerable. Not his father's, patient, compromised, still searching for the shape of a modern crown. Something else. A different kind of king is a sentence that can mean anything until you begin to live it, and then it means exactly what each day will ask. He imagined small reforms that mattered because they accumulated. He imagined refusing the lie that family must be sacrificed to duty, or that duty can excuse cruelty. He imagined telling the truth before the press found it. He imagined his mother's name spoken inside rooms where it had been whispered as caution and threat, spoken instead as compass. The house moved into sleep. They checked locks and lights because that's what you do when the wider world is a storm. You make the small circle safe. He paused at each child's door, learning their breaths again, the way he always did after a night spent pretending to be made of stone. George's posters blinked in the dim. Charlotte's splay of books formed a fort. Louis clutched the rabbit he was too old for and would always be allowed to keep. William tensed at how much he wanted to buy them time and relaxed at the knowledge that wanting is not the same as failing. Back in their room, Kate undid the cufflinks she had fastened, the ritual reversed. Armor off, skin and fatigue, and the particular holiness of a marriage that has been forced to be both romance and rampart. Tomorrow, he said into her hair, we'll start building the thing we keep saying we believe in. She said tomorrow back, and they decided that tonight they would be two people with a bed and a dark room and a door that shut. Sleep didn't come easily. The mind has its own palace in the small hours and insists on touring every room. He walked them all, the banquet with its glimmering knives, The study with its ticking clock. The corridor where he had heard Camilla's unguarded command. The kitchen with the question marks. The car with the word months on the seat between them. He kept circling the moment his chair scraped and the moment his father's hand trembled. He hated how those two sounds belonged to the same song, and how if he listened well, the melody underneath them was love. Morning would begin again with toast and kettles and butter soft in its dish, if they were lucky. The photographs would be merciless. The headlines would decide he was either a crusader or a traitor to the unflappable myth. He had no control over the adjectives, only the verbs. Apologize, include, disclose, prepare, ask, hold. The simple ones are the most difficult, and they are the only ones worth practicing. He thought of Camilla as he drifted. The first time since the confrontation without heat. Not the villain of a story, not the heroine. A woman who had known how institutions can crush, who had learned to survive by anticipating winters, who had made herself necessary to a man who loved her. He would speak to her as a son and as a prince. She would answer as a wife and as a queen. They would try to build a bridge from those four people to something that could still do the work required of all of them. He would tell her that secrecy rot spreads. She would tell him that survival requires whispered rooms. They would not agree. They would try anyway. He also thought of his father, of the boy in the man and the man in the king. He pictured the handshake across the desk that had been both too formal and not enough, the way it had meant more than any hug would have because of who they had been trained to be. He heard again the admission, months, and marveled that truth, once spoken aloud, can make the air feel more breathable, even when the content is unbearable. He had asked for the whole truth. He had received enough to begin the practice of being ready without becoming cruel. When dawn finally threaded itself through the curtains, it found them as it had the day before, a man and a woman in a house that was too small for the size of their responsibilities and just large enough for their love. They would do ordinary things first: make beds, pour cereal, sign a school form, tuck the family tree back into a folder so a child could carry it to a classroom, and learn that history is both names you inherit and lines you draw yourself. Then they would walk into rooms where the air remembered last night and make it remember something else. Two people choosing to repair. He put on a shirt. He chose a tie. He practiced the move of setting his jaw without making his face a fortress. Kate watched him with the concentration of a dancer, learning new choreography. Both, she reminded him softly, son and prince, and he took the word like a coin stamped with two heads. He would spend it all day. At mid-morning he asked to see Camilla privately. There are conversations that require tables and witnesses. This was not that. She came in with the caution of someone who has been watched by the world too long and knows how rarely it watches with kindness. He told her he was sorry for the public hurt. He told her he would not apologize for wanting to be included in the plans that measure out a nation's heartbeat. She told him she had done what she thought he couldn't bear. He told her that not bearing it together was worse. They did not become friends. They reached an armistice held together by a single shared desire, to keep a dying man from carrying the crown's weight in one set of trembling hands. By lunch, the palace issued a statement whose commas had been negotiated like borders. Transparency, treatment, temporary delegation of duties. Words that signal steadiness while admitting the cliff. He agreed to a short appearance, no questions, just a face for the cameras to photograph in daylight, rather. Then by the flashbang of scandal, and he found himself speaking to a bank of lenses with the odd sensation that he was talking to his children 10 years from now. "We'll be open about what we can be," he said, meaning it. "We'll ask for grace when we can't." He was talking to the public, he was asking himself. By afternoon he had 3 meetings, 2 briefings and 1 visit to a hospital ward, penciled into a calendar that had not left room for grief, but would now have to accommodate it. He kept his father's study appointment and looked for reasons to smile. There were still some. A note from George's teacher saying the family tree project was excellent. A text from an old army friend. The kettle clicking off in a quiet kitchen. A moment in a corridor when Charles laughed, actually laughed, at a joke too small to survive in print but large enough to fill a room between a father and a son. And that night, because nights always come no matter how bright the rooms have been, he lay again beside Kate and felt the crowns hover above them, its gravitational pull real and relentless. He did not flinch from it. He also did not invite it down, not yet. He was learning the discipline of living in the near future without sacrificing the present whole. He had months, a word that can feel like an insult, until you add the right companions to it. Together. Honest, prepared. He pictured again the question marks on George's poster, those tidy little hooks waiting for answers. He understood them now, not as a deficit, but as a kind of promise. Life would write its names when it was ready. In the meantime, their job was to be the kind of people whose answers, when they came, would be worthy of the branches that held them. He turned out the light. The house breathed. Somewhere on another road, cameras slept and woke and slept again. Somewhere in a different wing of a vast building, a tired man closed his eyes with medicine still bitter on his tongue. Somewhere in a smaller room, a woman who had said the wrong thing at the wrong time and believed it was the right thing for the right reason wiped away the last of last night's mascara and planned how to be necessary without being a threat. William threaded his fingers through Kate's and let the quiet gather around them, a thin, strong net. The future was already walking up the path. He could hear its steps. But so was morning, and bread would still pop and butter would still soften, and the little ordinary anchors would hold. For now that was enough. Tomorrow he would go back to the study, to the kitchen, to the balcony, to the ancient stage and the private rooms behind it, and he would practice the verb that matters most to every heir and every son.